Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Zhang and I'm the founder and host of Empathy Gaps, an online YouTube video podcast. Losing someone to addiction isn't easy. In today's episode, Sally and I will discuss addiction, grief, and coping with the loss. Here is my conversation with her. Hi everyone, and welcome to Empathy Gaps, an online video podcast focused on creating a safe space to discuss mental health and psychology. I'm Tiffany Zhang, your host, and today we have a very special guest, Sally Mcquillen. Sally is a psychotherapist specializing in addiction recovery, grief, and trauma healing, and she is also the author of the memoir Reaching for Beautiful, a memoir of loving and losing a wild child, which just recently came out. Sally, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to join me. Before we start, is there anything else that you want to add regarding to what you do or who you are?
I am just so pleased to be with you and thrilled that my personal experience and my professional experience end up dovetailing the way that they do. And um, so Empathy Gap, what a wonderful title for a podcast.
Thank you so much. So, I guess for the first question, can you tell us a little bit about like what your memoir is about for the people who may not know?
Of course, Reaching for Beautiful is a book that I wrote to honor my son Christopher, who we lost about 9 years ago at the age of 21 in an accident. And it is the story that takes place. It's sort of an inside look at my own grief in the first year and a half after he passed, but it's also the story of his life, what it was like to raise this very wild child of mine and how he kept me on my toes and what he has taught me both in life and since in spirit.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for sharing. And what does like the phrase like reaching for beautiful like mean to you? Like I think that's such an interesting phrase that like I don't hear often.
It was so interesting. After Christopher died, one of the things that he had so many friends were a huge part of who he was. And so on social media, his friends began to um, post this tweet that he had made. And I guess he was on Twitter, and unbeknownst to his mother, he was on Twitter. And that was during that time period. I don't even know what's happening in the social media world now with that. But that being said, his um, he said, and this was probably about a month or so before he died, life is honestly so beautiful as long as you allow it to be. And like me, he was a deeply feeling person. And so I know that even though he was the life of the party and often very open-hearted and compassionate, part of that was born of his own struggles, feeling different as a little boy with attention deficit and some learning issues, feeling different because very early in his life, he struggled with addiction. He ended up having 3 years where he was clean and sober from the age of 16 to 19. And then when he went to college, ended up resuming partying with his friends. And that's actually a chapter that I'm not sorry that he had, because part of his pain was related to wanting to be normal and not different in any way. And so, this idea of life being beautiful, being a choice, being something that we need to rise above our own suffering and look for the joy. And I actually have those words on a bracelet to remind me too. It's just something that's become this mantra for me, a talisman that has helped me. Not that I haven't felt incredible anguish, but to also sort of lean into it, move through it so that I can find what's beautiful, even without his beauty being something I can see and touch. Um, I'm always reaching for him and trying to embody. his light.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful phrase. And yeah, as I mentioned before, I never really heard of it, but I think it is really beautiful how it's like well, it's like exactly what you said. Like it's kind of like a mantra and also just like a very good way to look at life and stuff. And how like did you find the courage to start like writing this book and stuff?
Well, I will tell you, I didn't know what it was going to become. I was writing to Christopher very early. A Facebook friend said, "You know what? Maybe you should journal during this time." And that had been a suggestion that I'd heard plenty of times as a therapist. I'd even probably recommended to other people that they do some journaling. I had no idea what kind of healing would be possible in the writing of Reaching for Beautiful, but mostly it came out of desperation, Tiffany. It was sort of like I wanted to continue to connect with my son and talk to him and let him in on what I was experiencing. So that's where it began.
Did you find it very like nerve-wracking to like actually publish this book and like make like your own experiences public? Like what was that kind of journey like?
Yes, I've been thinking about this idea that there's so much vulnerability um, in putting a book out into the world. There's really literally nothing that you don't end up knowing about me and my life and my children and my experience and some of the things that are hard for other people to know, some of my regrets or my guilt or my um, humanness, and I think I'm so interested and so grateful when other people can be vulnerable with me that I find a lot of strength in it. So even though it was scary, I feel like it was an act of courage. And I feel like there was a reason, and that reason was if this helps someone else feel less alone, I'm for it. And Christopher would be too.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I think it really is courageous, like publishing your own thoughts and experiences out into the real world. And I'm sure your book, to anyone who's read it, has like inspired them a lot and has helped them like get through the process. And I kind of just wanted to touch on what you said earlier about how the book was originally like writing to Christopher. I had another interview on this podcast with Dr. Kaplow, and she was basically saying like one way to help like get through grief of someone who has recently passed is to like write letters to them. And so I think that is so beautiful. Like you just like originally dedicating it to him and then like publishing it so that other people can like read and learn from it.
I have to say, the more I think about it, being able to connect to him, um, keeping his spirit alive, really, one of the things that people have said who've read it so far have said, "Oh, I never knew him when he was here, but now I really have this sense of him." That gives me so much, it's just pride and joy. And this idea of connection, from a mental health standpoint, um, grief can be very alienating. And and I feel like one of the things that helped me was to find a way to connect with Christopher and really get to a point where he he's really a part of me. We are connected. We've always been connected and we always will. And but to be able to be connected to other people too is extremely healing because I am this walking representation of what many parents fear will happen. And I completely understand that. So it's very instinctive to almost want to separate yourself from any discussion about grief or the loss of a child. And I get it. It's at first blush, you're just like this. But when people can lean into my story in the same way that when I can lean into my sadness, it creates more lightness and it's just a beautiful gift.
Yeah, of course. And also in your book, you said that you had like a bittersweet illusion of like keeping your son safe. Can you talk a little bit about exactly what like bittersweet illusion means?
Yes. It's funny. I think one of the things that Christopher has taught me, and one of the things I really needed to learn and continue to keep getting opportunities to learn as I raise my all of my children. I have two other living children, and just in general is appreciating what an illusion it is that we have so much control, that we think we have power, or at least I did. I thought I had the power to control different things, and I lost sight of where I did have power. And in my work as a therapist, a lot of what I end up talking to my clients about is practicing the serenity prayer, which is sort of identifying where we do have power and where it's appropriate for us to let go, where our fear is driving us, and where we can try to actually simply love our children and everyone around us enough that the fear dissolves. The bittersweet illusion was to think I could prevent my son from developing addiction, that I could keep him sober, that I could keep him alive. And and the power lies in loving him so unconditionally. It lies in not letting fear interfere with our relationship when he was here, like consciously letting go of that and just being again connected and trusting in that connection. When I was chasing him and trying to track him down, and he was just a wild Mustang. When I was trying to rein him in, that was inadvertently a way of like not letting him be who he was. And that was his beauty, was to be so purely all in the moment. And I wouldn't really want to have changed that, and I never had the power to change it anyway.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about control because I feel like a lot of like people's anxieties revolve around things that they can't control, but I think it definitely helps when you think about things and you really analyze what you can control and what you can't control. I feel like that definitely helps with a lot of like guilt and just like stress and just like other negative emotions.
It's so true. We're so just hard on ourselves. And so this idea of control, we apply it to other people's behavior. We end up feeling such frustration and powerlessness when we set ourselves up to not be able to do anything about certain things. Instead, when we can accept those things, when we can sort of make peace with things being different than maybe we wanted them to be, or then would be easier for us, then we can hone in on, I think the only thing we can really control is how we ourselves respond to other people and things. And then give ourselves grace too, give ourselves more compassion and kindness, because living this life is challenging, meant to be.
Yeah. And also in your book, you also said that grief has taught, you talked a little bit about it before, but you also said that grief has taught you about the power of love. You talked a little bit about like unconditional love and stuff, but can you like go a little bit more in depth about the relationship between like grief and love?
Yes, I do feel like there is this direct correlation. So when I'll speak for myself, loving Christopher as fiercely, having this mad crush on him from the moment he arrived, really not being able to love him any more than I do. that also meant that I was going to experience tremendous pain when he passed, when he, again, it was this, my world was rocked. And so there was, and there still sometimes is, an emptiness that he left. There's a huge vacancy. And I've, done work over the last 9 years to fill that with his spirit. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it's enough. Sometimes I just would love to see those gorgeous, sparkly green eyes, and give him a hug. Um, but I think we know that, part of me thought, okay, do I just close up my heart and protect it so that I don't have to ever experience this again? Do I armor myself from this? And Christopher's message to me is love is actually the only thing that matters. It's the only thing. And so it's my task to completely keep that part of me open and vulnerable, even though it will get hurt, even though there will be losses, because that's part of life. Um, I don't know if I answered it, but I do know I needed to lean into the sadness, surrender to it, let it come over me, because he losing him warrants that. You know what I mean? It would be ridiculous to act as if there wasn't excruciating pain.
hmm Yeah, I think that kind of reminds me of something. So, I was an intern at OCD Institute of Texas, and I got to sit on into a lot of their like group therapy things, group therapy sessions. And one of the things that like one of the group therapists said was like, if you feel anxiety about like not performing a ritual, like don't try to minimize the anxiety. Like you have to lean into the uncertainty and stuff and like learn how to live with the anxiety. And so I think that just like reminded me of what you said. And you also talked about like trying to like fill the void and stuff. And so like as a therapist who like specializes in addiction and grief, how did your like personal knowledge like help or like complicate your grieving process? And like what are some things that you learned throughout the grieving process that you didn't know as a therapist like before?
Oh, good question. I think in some ways being a therapist helped me intellectually appreciate the importance of moving through feelings. We can't fight them. I often am working with people who try to keep their uncomfortable feelings at bay. In some ways, I was so bereaved, I had no choice but to just be, saturated with tears for years. Um, but we also do this thing that I was kind of referring to before, where we think that to be strong means to keep everything in check, to present sort of as if we've got this handled. And I've I was raised that way. I can pull things off that way, Tiffany, where you wouldn't necessarily know I'm hurting inside. So I it has meant like practicing what I preach to other people, to let them in, to sort of receive support, not go into this whole I've got this. Um, Again, it's sort of this lonely road, but letting other people into it. And some people we know can't come in. It's too threatening. But for the people who've had the courage to have empathy, to be able to walk beside me, um, wow, what a gift that's been. And um, again, that self-compassion. I'd heard the word self-compassion so many times as a therapist, but to really make this, and I think it's what it took for me, to be honest, to lose a child. It had to come to that, to precipitate being willing to take care of myself in a whole different way, at a whole different level, to use absolutely every possible resource that there was,
Mhm.
to see a therapist of my own, which I had been, to go seek out specialized EMDR therapy for the trauma of the way that I lost him, to just really give myself permission to even take time off of work, those kinds of things, to cheer myself on if I actually got out of bed, really that at that level, that's what being a therapist and actually practicing what I suggested to others
Mhm.
helped me do. And then sometimes the disadvantage of being a therapist, or just maybe just being me, because I'm sort of a natural therapist, is that like you could almost take, oh, well, you should know better, or you should be further along, or you should do it this way. And again, it could almost contribute to being harder on myself,
Mhm.
putting higher expectations on me,
Mhm.
um, and having to have I don't know, it's just funny. I can almost not entirely let go of doing this thing that I see so many of my clients do. Like I will be strong in this way.
Mhm.
And my greatest strength is when I can cry, or when I can admit or speak to the agony of those feelings, but also not get lost in them.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the intersection of like your expertise as a therapist and also like your personal experience, I think is really valuable insight, which is why I think your memoir is so powerful because of just like the intersection of those two identities. And I wanted to transition to some strategies. So, what would be some like words of advice for someone who is trying to support someone who is battling through addiction?
Addiction has it takes such a toll on the people who struggle. But I have to say, I work with many people who are even more gravely impacted because they love someone who's struggling with addiction, and talk about that same idea of beginning to make sense of where we have control. There's something about when someone is under the influence of addiction that pulls us into um, trying to rescue them from it, and they really have to come to their own um, sort of crises. They actually have to experience the consequences of their behavior in order to get some sort of a wake up call. And so oftentimes we end up doing the very thing by enabling them that prolongs their use. And it gets really tricky, even though I have personal and professional expertise with addiction. It's still so baffling sometimes. Um, but to take care of ourselves first, to put our oxygen mask on, that's where the power lies.
Hmm. Yeah, again, that kind of reminds me of something that I learned when I was at OCD Institute, Texas. They were basically saying how, like, even though the family's intentions may be pure, they might, like, their behaviors might be, like, propelling the cycle of, like, doing the rituals and stuff. And so I think that kind what you just said resonated with me. And I guess one last question to close this interview off. What would be some words of advice for someone who is now in the grieving process of losing someone to addiction?
Losing someone to addiction, or essentially losing a child, losing any loved one, um, it creates such powerlessness. And so our power lies in letting it wash over us, um, and in forgiveness of ourselves. One of the natural outcomes, I think, when we're grieving, I don't know that there's ever a time when someone's grieving when our first response to that powerlessness isn't to blame ourselves, to go into deep regret, to beat ourselves up. Um, and if we can find a way to move through it with self-forgiveness, that's critical. It also means having to face what is, and that's a process. So for anyone grieving, just respecting this long process. I say in Reaching for Beautiful that it took me over 7 years to feel like myself again. And sometimes society wants us to be all better overnight. They want to silver lining it. They want to remind us that we have other children. They want to take our pain away. And we are going to just have to recognize that this is a much longer process and one we need to be gentle with ourselves about.
That's such a beautiful note to end this interview on. And yeah, thank you so much, Sally, for sharing all your insights. I really enjoyed this conversation and getting to learn more about like the addiction process and also the healing process. And to where can people find your book if they want to buy it?
Reaching for Beautiful is available wherever books are sold, or they can go to my website, www.sallymcquillen.com.
Of course. And that will be in the description box below. So, again, thank you so much, Sally, for coming on and speaking with me. And I will see everyone next time. Bye.
Bye.